Good afternoon to you. Mark Sutt of HurricaneTrack.com here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for January 9th, 2017. Let's begin today's tour of what's happening first in the world of the tropics. Hurricane season, obviously several months away, but we like to look at different things that may shape its evolution as we get to June and beyond. And one of those things is the sea surface temperature anomalies, the departures from normal in the Pacific today. Kind of a moderation of this La Nina that we had, a weak La Nina. Temperatures are slowly starting to come up across this region. Overall, more towards neutral conditions. Fairly cold up here in the northern Pacific for what it's worth, and a few cold patches relative to average in the South Pacific. But, the attention turning to the Atlantic, which is where things will obviously matter once we get to June and beyond. Clearly, the western Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, very warm compared to normal, very, very much so. Several degrees Celsius and, of course, Fahrenheit in some areas of the northwest Atlantic and into the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, off the coast of Africa towards the Lesser Antilles, what we call the main development region, that area, generally normal to slightly above. The bottom line is across the Atlantic, we don't see any of this sitting over here or anything like that, or up in this area. And until this cools off dramatically, and if it ever does, then the Atlantic basin should, just what happens when you try to say basin and should next to each other, stay fairly active overall. However, it's just January, and it's really hard to predict what will happen down the road. Does this become warmer through here, and we get an El Nino event, and does the Atlantic suddenly cool, especially down in this region, or up in the northeast Atlantic up here, which would result in a lot drier conditions? It's just impossible to know. So each week we can kind of take a look at how things are going. Think about an athlete in your favorite sport, basketball, football, whatever the case may be. On a weekly basis, you want to check up on that athlete, see how they're doing. And, you follow that athlete all along in whatever sport it may be, and you say, okay, they're doing pretty healthy, but you cannot predict the future. That, right before the big game, some tournament or championship game, whether it be golf, tennis, football, basketball, whatever, that athlete could have an injury. They could get sick. A number of things can happen that are simply not predictable. And the way that relates to the weather here is you just never know. You can look and see what the state of things is now, or state of things are, things being plural. You use the word are, I guess, right? You look at the state of things and how they are now, and then you try to make model guesses based on that. And another tool is, of course, the subsurface temperatures of the equatorial Pacific. And we see that we're now just left with a few islands of colder than normal subsurface temperatures, and a fairly large area of above normal subsurface warming. But this is nothing that concerns me to make me think there's an El Nino coming of any significance. I'll have to go back and dig up what this looked like back in 2015 as an example and show you the difference here. We're only talking about one area of maybe 2 degrees Celsius above normal, way down here at 150 meters deep in the ocean. Up here at the surface, we're basically at neutral conditions with just a few patches of colder and a little patch of slightly warmer in the western equatorial Pacific. So not too concerning yet that we're headed towards an El Nino, and further leaning towards that idea and lending credence to it is the Southern Oscillation Index, the overall pressure pattern in the Pacific, and they finally worked out that negative, whatever it was, triple-digit anomaly that was in there. Today's contribution is a healthy positive 19. We can basically round it up to 20, and our 30-day is at a pretty respectable positive 6, and even the 90-day is basically right at neutral. So we don't see any of these numbers over here crashing substantially negative, and until and unless we see that, we're really not going to be headed towards an El Nino pattern. You're going to get these different changes in the atmosphere, but these are all the things that you watch. And back to the athlete analogy, you can check out the athlete's performance in the game, You can, see what their health is doing. Do they have a fever? Do they have a cold? How are all their muscles doing? Any sprains, twists, or pulls that we need to be aware of? And that's what all these different indices that we look at, from the actual sea surface temperature anomalies to the subsurface anomalies to the background pressure pattern. And you look at all these and you say, okay, for now, everything suggests that we would have a particularly at least normal to maybe slightly busier than normal hurricane season in the Atlantic. But the point is, things can change. But that's why we do this on a weekly basis, to see if they are changing. And so far, they are not. And if there is any change, it's very slow. And that's important to note. This continues to fascinate me. 26 degrees Celsius, isotherm right here off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Very warm water, as I showed you, anomalously above normal here in the northwest Atlantic. Just incredible. You think about the low temperatures that we had over North Carolina, South Carolina, these last couple of nights, especially last night, with limited snow cover and ice cover, especially over the areas away from the sandhills. And then you just go a couple hundred miles south over the Atlantic, and the water temperatures were in some cases almost 60 degrees warmer than the air temperatures. That's pretty remarkable. In the Gulf of Mexico, remember I showed you the anomalies? Well, you're going to have very cold shelf water this time of year. But look at this, the 26 degrees Celsius isotherm, and that's just what we consider the threshold for hurricane formation generally. There it is for the most part, has not shrunk away. In fact, this has nosed its way up into the southeast Gulf. And we're not too far away once we get, the days are already getting longer. And so there's a very slow, drawn-out lag as to when the ocean starts to respond to that by warming up again. But these isotherms, and isotherm is just a fancy way of saying line of equal temperature, these lines of equal temperature here, these isotherms are going to start advancing north again and filling in more and more. I don't know what the average date is. I guess I could research that. But once we get into February, the days are noticeably longer. There's more incoming solar radiation, and we're going to start to reverse this, and it'll start to warm up again naturally. So it's pretty remarkable that the 80-degree line is way up here, not too far off of Naples and Tampa up here, Tampa, Naples area, Fort Myers. So we'll watch and see how this evolves. If we get a major winter storm this year, the one we just had was significant, but really didn't deepen that much. This warm Gulf could play into that. Speaking of winter storms, the lower 48 weather is transitioning into that right now. Still some advisories here for parts of North Carolina due to all the ice that's still around. Let me close a couple of tabs on here to free up some of my memory to help the computer not to bog down. I got a new one coming, which is going to be great for the year ahead. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, around the Great Lakes as well, really no major problems over here, just isolated, hazardous driving conditions, etc. The real issues, as you may have been hearing, are out west, where this atmospheric river, just a stream of moisture, has been coming in, and as such, much needed but problematic rainfall because there's been too much of it. Some damage, property damage, people having to deal with that, river floods. But you know what? You have to have that moisture, and unfortunately, sometimes you can't have the weather. Nobody owns the weather. You can't tell it to do something in your favor. Sorry, you can't. At least not yet. Geoengineering, for people who think that it's true, well, maybe on certain scales, but in this case, you have to have that moisture. It's critical to the area, and it does come with some rather nasty effects, unfortunately, but at least you're getting the moisture. Look at it that way, trying to have the silver lining in here. Now, here's what it looks like on water vapor imagery. You can see this stream of moisture coming in, even some very heavy rains in Southern California. The very famous, if you've seen him on the Weather Channel, and some of his incredible adventures, Josh Morgerman in Southern California, who's been in some of the strongest, in fact, the strongest cyclones in history in modern times. He lives down here in Southern California, not far from Los Angeles, and he tweeted earlier today that heavy rain, he could hear it on his roof. That's pretty awesome for the LA basin. But this pattern is going to continue. Look at that little swirly in there. All this energy rotating into the western United States, coming in on this zonal flow. If you look at this, the 500 millibar pattern, first of all, here's the west coast of the U.S. There's California and the Baja over here on the east coast, Carolinas, Florida, etc. So there's your outline, so you know what's what. And so here's these pieces of energy that are just coming in one after the other, and the flow is going to be much more zonal now. You notice we've lost any deep trough over the east, and as we go through time, this is 24 hours out, here's 48 hours, and again, that energy just coming in. Each of these linear areas of energy in here, this vorticity or spin or energy in the atmosphere, all of that is equated to storminess coming into the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast proper. 72 hours out, again, troughing, building back in over the west, and a ridge of high pressure building over the southwest Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. No surprise, considering how warm this water is. It surely has to aid into that. And look, you see the trough digging out west and the ridge building over the southeast United States, so that by day 4, that trough deepens out west, the ridge strengthens over the east, and most of your polar vortex, cold, brutal, energy-laden, very dry air that's like just ridiculously cold, generally locked north of the Canadian border for the next several days, what we call the January thaw. All right, so then by day 5, pretty potent upper-level low, going to kind of rotate through, will make for some interesting weather over the next week in here, and I may do an update about that on Friday, as we may have an ice storm develop in the plains and parts of Texas. Meanwhile, over the southeast, areas that were cold and icy are going to be in the 70s by the latter part of this week, and it's just incredible. Great for the sidewalk cracking and repair business, right? People who fix cracked sidewalks, this is your kind of weather. I don't know what kind of a niche market that is, but when you freeze thaw this ridiculously, it was 15, 17 degrees, something like that here in Wilmington last night, and it's going to be in the low to mid 70s on Friday. Yep, that's going to crack your concrete. Such as the weather goes in the southeast. All right, well, that's it for me. I hope that's not it for me. That'd be bad. Let's try that ending again. That's it from me. I guess you could say that's it for me for today, because I won't be back doing any more of this today, so it kind of works out. But yeah, I'm done for today. I appreciate you tuning in, as always. And it's great. The subscriber count is going back up ever so slightly on the YouTube. People bail out after hurricane season. I don't need to subscribe to that anymore. But, some interesting things going on. We've picked up a few, and I do appreciate it. It's nice to see an audience out there that appreciates this and hopefully learns something from it. So if you haven't subscribed yet, do so, and follow on Twitter at Hurricane Track. And you can get all the updates as we move through the winter and eventually into the spring and summer, and then my favorite time of year, hurricane season. All right? Have a great rest of your week ahead. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com, and I'll talk to you again probably later in the week, and then, of course, again with the full off-season edition next Monday.